A monarchy can survive ignorant subjects. An empire can be administered by a literate clerisy while the masses know nothing of its workings. A dictatorship positively requires the ignorance of its people, but a republic, a government of, by, and for the people, depends on a capacity that no child is born possessing and no constitution can conjure into existence: the ability to govern oneself. This ability is not inherited. It is not instinctive. It does not arise from good intentions or native intelligence or access to information. It must be transmitted deliberately, painstakingly, generation after generation, or it is lost. Every civilization that has thought carefully about education has understood this. The Greeks called it paideia, the formation of the citizen, not merely the instruction of the student. The Romans transmitted their founding myths: Cincinnatus at the plow, Brutus condemning his own sons, Horatius at the bridge, not as entertainment, but as moral architecture, stories that taught the young what the Republic expected of them before they were old enough to know they were being taught. The early American township accomplished the same thing without a curriculum. A child who watched his father serve on the jury, argue at the town meeting, and shake hands with the man he had argued against was receiving a civic education more potent than any textbook. The transmission was never automatic. It was never easy. And in America, in the 250th year of the Republic, it has very nearly stopped. What the Republic transmitted, when it transmitted anything worth transmitting, was not a body of information. It was a disposition. The difference matters more than any debate about curriculum, because a man can memorize the three branches of government and remain utterly incapable of self-governance, while a man who has never read the Constitution, but who learned at his mother's table to argue without attacking, to lose without quitting, and to hold his convictions firmly enough to defend them and loosely enough to revise them, possesses the one thing the Republic actually requires. The disposition has several components, and none of them is natural. The first is the habit of thinking for oneself, not merely having opinions which any fool can manage, but testing those opinions against evidence, argument, and the possibility that they are wrong. The second is the tolerance of disagreement, the trained capacity to live alongside people who believe things you find abhorrent without concluding that their right to hold those beliefs should be revoked. The third is a sense of obligation to something larger than your own household, the community, the commonwealth, the republic itself, not as abstraction but as the thing your participation sustains or your absence degrades. These are not virtues that emerge spontaneously. They are the product of formation, moral formation, which is a different thing entirely from instruction. Instruction tells you what the Bill of Rights says. Formation is the process by which you come to feel, in your bones, why it matters. Not because a teacher told you it was important, but because you were raised in a household, a church, a neighborhood, a school where people conducted themselves as though it were important, where the adults around you argued honestly, conceded when they were wrong, and treated the man who disagreed with them as a citizen entitled to his error rather than an enemy to be destroyed. A 20th century writer identified the problem with devastating precision. The modern educator, he observed, claims to cut away what he considers the irrational elements in moral training: the sentiments, the trained emotions, the inherited sense of honor and shame and duty, while expecting the student to behave as though those elements were still in place. We produce, he wrote, men without chests, and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We strip the young of the trained moral responses that connect what they know to what they do, and then express astonishment when they know everything and do nothing. The transmission was never merely intellectual. It was the formation of what the ancients called character, and what the moderns, having lost the concept, have no word for at all. And the institutions that once accomplished this formation, the family, the church, the local school, the civic association, have either abandoned the task, been forbidden from attempting it, or been replaced by technologies designed to do the opposite. The American argument about education has become a war, and like most wars, it has destroyed the thing both sides claim to be fighting for. The right, which claims guardianship of the tradition, has confused conservation with sanitization. To conserve a tradition is to hand it to the next generation with enough honesty that they can see its flaws and enough love that they will want to repair them. The right has instead turned the tradition into a loyalty test. State legislatures dictating which questions may be asked about the nation's own history. School boards transformed from civic institutions into tribunals of orthodoxy and curricula reduced to catechism. The right's instinct that something has gone wrong in how the national story is taught is not baseless, but its response has been to forbid complexity rather than teach it. You do not protect a tradition by making it illegal to examine. The left, which claims the mantle of honest reckoning, has confused understanding with prosecution. To understand a tradition is to hold its failures and its achievements in the same hand, to see the slaveholder and the Emancipation Clause in the same constitutional sentence. The left has instead taught the young to approach the national story as a case to be tried. Every institution a crime scene, every founding document an exhibit, every inherited practice guilty until proven otherwise. The left's instinct that the nation's history contains horrors which were suppressed or sanitized for generations is not baseless, but its response has produced students who can catalog oppression in extraordinary detail and have no trained reason to believe the Republic is worth repairing. The humanities have lost nearly a third of their enrollment in a decade, abandoned by students who were taught to regard them as instruments of the powerful rather than tools for understanding power. The result is a generation caught in the crossfire. 2/3 of American teachers now self-censor on political and social topics. More than half do so even where no restrictive law exists. Fear of controversy has become the primary obstacle to civic education. They are not being silenced by either side's legislation alone. They are being silenced by a culture in which any honest engagement with American history has become a political act, subject to complaint from the right for complicating the national story and complaint from the left for treating it as anything other than a catalog of crimes. The teacher who tells the truth about the founding, that it was the work of slaveholders who wrote the means of moral correction into the same document, satisfies neither side. And so she says nothing, and the student learns nothing, and the tradition dies not of critique or censorship, but of silence. Both sides have made the same fundamental error. They have treated education as a front in a political war rather than as the means by which a civilization reproduces itself. The right fights to control the story. The left fights to demolish it. Neither is transmitting it. And a generation is growing up in the no man's land between them, inheriting a republic that no one has bothered to explain, not because the explanation is impossible, but because every adult in the room is too busy fighting over the curriculum to teach it. The evidence of the transmission's failure is not ambiguous. 13% of American 8th graders score proficient in their own nation's history. 22% in civics. 4 in 10 score below the basic level of knowledge, meaning they cannot identify rudimentary facts about the country they will be asked to govern as adults. Among Americans under 30, nearly 2 in 3 describe their democracy as broken or failed. Only 1 in 16 calls it healthy. These numbers are not evidence of youthful cynicism. They are evidence of an absence. You cannot be cynical about a thing you were never taught to understand. Cynicism requires knowledge and then disillusionment. What the data describe is something prior and more damaging. A generation that was handed the keys to a republic and never shown where the engine is, what the controls do, or why the machine was built in the first place. They are not disillusioned. They were never illusioned. No one did them the courtesy of explaining what they were inheriting, and now they are being blamed for not valuing it. Meanwhile, the Federal Department of Education is being dismantled. This is not, in itself, the crisis. A bureaucracy that has grown so large and so self-serving that it consumes resources without producing education is a bureaucracy that deserves scrutiny, and there is a respectable case, a Tocquevillian case, that education belongs at the local level, closest to the citizens it serves. The township was Liberty's primary school precisely because it was local, intimate, accountable. The founders did not create a federal department of civic formation, and it is entirely plausible that no such department is needed. But the question is not who holds the authority. The question is whether anyone exercises it. Return education to the states, to the districts, to the school boards, and the school boards are fighting over which books to ban. Return it to the communities, and the communities have emptied out of the civic associations that once formed citizens without a curriculum. Return it to the families, and both parents are working, and the children are being formed not by conversation at the dinner table, but by algorithms that teach them to perform outrage rather than practice deliberation. The transmission has failed at every level, and rearranging which institution holds the responsibility changes nothing if no institution is willing to do the work. You cannot fix a transmission failure by reorganizing the transmitter. You fix it by remembering what must be transmitted. Self-governance demands things of the citizen that no one is born knowing how to provide: honest argument, shared sacrifice, the tolerance of disagreement, the restraint of certainty. The question that precedes all of these is how the citizen becomes capable of them in the first place. The answer is not instruction. It is not a better textbook, a revised curriculum, a mandatory semester of government. These are not useless, but they are not sufficient, because the capacity for self-governance is not a body of knowledge. It is a way of being in the world, a disposition formed slowly through practice and example, in which the citizen learns to hold complexity without collapsing into certainty, to argue without hating, to love a thing honestly enough to name its failures and seriously enough to insist on their repair. What must be transmitted is precisely this: the capacity to hold two truths at once. The Republic was built by slaveholders, and it contains within itself the means of moral correction. The founding documents are products of their time, and they articulate principles that transcend any time. The nation has committed grievous wrongs, and it has produced, from within its own constitutional framework, the legal and political means of redress. A citizen who can hold both halves of these sentences is a citizen capable of self-governance. A citizen who can hold only one, either the pride or the shame, either the defense or the indictment, is a partisan, and partisans do not govern themselves. They merely take turns governing each other. This is what the transmission must carry: not a catechism, not a sanitized legend, not an indictment dressed as history, the full, difficult, contradictory truth about a republic that is both flawed and repairable, both guilty and capable of justice, both broken in specific ways and functional in ways that no other large-scale experiment in self-governance has matched. The young must be told this, and they must be told it by adults who believe it, because children can detect a lie in the telling. If the adults do not believe the Republic is worth defending, no curriculum will convince the young. And if the adults do believe it but are too frightened to say so, the silence teaches its own lesson. The transmission is not the government's job. It never was. It is the job of every citizen who has received the inheritance and means to pass it on. The parent who turns off the screen and argues with the child at dinner, not to win but to teach the child what honest argument sounds like. The teacher who tells the truth about the founding, the genius and the crime, and trusts the student to hold both. The neighbor who takes the teenager to the town meeting and lets her see, in the tedium and the procedure and the imperfect compromise, what self-governance actually looks like when it is not being performed for a camera. The Republic does not reproduce itself. It has no mechanism of self-perpetuation that operates without human effort. The Constitution is a blueprint, but a blueprint does not build the house. The institutions are scaffolding, but scaffolding does not raise the citizen. The transmission is the work of hands, Ordinary, unpaid, uncelebrated hands, passing the thing from one generation to the next with enough honesty to make it credible and enough conviction to make it worth receiving. Every generation is born knowing nothing of what it inherits. Every generation arrives as what the philosopher called a fresh invasion of barbarians. The question is never whether the barbarians will come. They come every year, in every delivery room, in every household in America. The question is whether the civilization meets them at the door. The barbarians are not at the gate. They are in the nursery. They are ours. And we are not teaching them.